In the watch world we have today, for new, vintage and even pre-owned watches, one model always sets the pulse racing more than any other. Regardless of the reference, the Daytona remains the timepiece everyone lusts after. It's no surprise that they are the most successful Rolex models. In recent times, the boom for neo-vintage timepieces has been glaringly evident, and the Zenith-equipped Daytona in particular is knocking on all doors now. Could this model eventually be the next Grail watch for collectors? Let's find out in today's video. We all know the tales of the Rolex Daytona and why it's the overwhelmingly favourite for so many collectors, right? In any given category of watches, either modern or vintage, Rolex's motorsports chronograph is ahead of the game. The Rolex Daytona has proven to be a simple yet efficient design, and one of the best parts of it all is that they even appreciate in value too. Until the dawn of the millennium, Rolex surprisingly didn't even have any in-house automatic chronograph movement in the Daytona line. Since they abandoned the Valjoule-based manually wound movement, Rolex had to rely heavily on Zenith to bring forth the internal components for their flagship. Zenith Daytonas have been around for quite a while now and have grown to become the timepiece collectors drool over the most. As a matter of fact, if you said it was a true icon, you wouldn't even be wrong. It's so loved that some collectors even whisper praises of the Zenith Daytona, claiming it to be the single greatest modern Rolex watch with a considerable potential for appreciation. Guys, judging by recent history, Grail watches are known to be so history orientated. It's almost like the timepiece with a better history wins. With that in mind, the neo-vintage Rolex Zenith is undeniably comfortable. They've been around for over 30 years, which we can all agree to be a ripe age. Alas, what's so special about this 1988 specific model, born in Geneva with the DNA of Zenith El Primero movement and Rolex's Daytona, that keeps it on the fast track to success? You see, the Zenith-equipped Daytona in particular represents what we call the movement of neo-vintage timepieces. For those who aren't too familiar with the concept, neo-vintage watches are timepieces made between the 80s and 90s that are still a bit young to be called a vintage watch, but also too mature to be classified as a modern piece too. And that's absolutely not a bad thing at all. As a matter of fact, the Zenith Daytona, it's a blessing. For the generation of watch enthusiasts who grew up in the 90s and are now at their pupae to become butterflies, or in this context, watch collectors, these neo-vintage timepieces just so happen to be one that catches their attention the most. But hey, don't just take our word for it. Here's what Tim Bender, the owner of Fog City Vintage and one of the biggest fans of the Zenith Daytona, said. The consumer of tomorrow isn't going to have the appreciation older collectors had for watches made before the late 80s. Another reason why the Zenith Daytona seems so enticing is because of how hazy in nostalgia it makes collectors feel. Back in the 90s, the internet wasn't so popular. There were no social media and no high-end PlayStation consoles. Nothing. The only form of socialization was being human, communicating, interacting and having actual conversations physically with others. When you pick up a Zenith Daytona, it takes you on a ride back in time, almost as if you woke up from your afternoon nap back in the 90s. Such nostalgia alone is worth the price for those who keenly admire the watch. Along with the shiny automatic wound movement, Rolex also brought some subtle aesthetic changes on the Zenith Daytona. And yes, you're right, the change in the case size was the most significant of them. In a time where the previous models that came before it had a smaller 37mm case, the Zenith Daytona, or reference 16520, had a much more bulky masculine case of 40mm, making it look similar to some of the other tool watches from the brand like GMT Master and hey, even the Rolex Submariner. Another significant change that came to the Zenith Daytona could be seen in the dials. The previous generations either had metallic silver dials or even matte black, but the Zenith Daytona came with a glossy dial. It also featured metal hour markers and luminous materials, and for the sub-dials they had a thin outer track of an opposing colour, with each being ringed with a metallic edge. Finally, the Zenith Daytona featured sapphire crystals to shield the dial, a never-seen-before concept from Rolex in the Daytona line. As subtle as one might think these changes were, they were more than enough to radically transform the Rolex Daytona for the better. You see, the previous references were aging and, by standard, basically outdated for modern desires. And don't even get us started about the fact that the movements had to be wound manually. It was so tiring. Also, in the 80s, everything laced with luxury was all about status. A 37mm case was largely deemed too feminine or too small, and when you consider all that, you see why Rolex didn't have the best sales then. Yes guys, you heard that right. As unimaginable as it may seem in recent times, Rolex once found it so difficult to make sales. Given how these subtle changes resonated well in the market when it got released, the Zenith Daytona generated a lot of buzzes, although the limited availability of the Zenith-based caliber only added more fuel to the fire. Everyone desperately wanted a Zenith Daytona. Due to the buzz and traffic, dealers sought to take advantage of the situation by piling up every piece they could lay their hands on, which in turn dramatically increased the prices on the secondary market to reach a valuation of almost double of the original recommended retail price. As the Zenith Daytona gets older, the more its significance and interest amongst collectors would rise. And so the Zenith-equipped Daytona has started to develop its very own cult, although that could largely be due to it being one of the last Rolex timepieces to significantly change its dial and bezel. The occasional watch fan may not realize how important those changes are, but alas, the enthusiasts and collectors worth their salt, that's the entire soul of the Zenith Daytona. Over its 12-year life of production, Rolex made some notable variations of the Zenith Daytona in separate references. The first was reference 16520 in steel, then reference 16523 in steel and yellow gold. We also have reference 16528 in yellow gold, reference 16518 in yellow gold again, but this time on a leather strap, and last but most certainly not least, reference 16519 in white gold on a leather strap. However, the brand also introduced several dual iterations within the aforementioned references made from Rolex. One of their notable features was the bezels and dials set with diamonds and other beautiful precious stones. Take for example the Rolex Zenith Daytona with the reference 16528 with 30 dial. Also, one of the notable iterations that have to be outlined is the Chairman Daytona, which is keenly covered by watch collectors for its documented rarity. However, the Chairman Daytona is more or less a special version of the Rolex Zenith Daytona with the reference 16528 in yellow gold. This special edition was produced in 1991, but insanely limited to 10 pieces. Given how there are basically 8 billion people on the planet, it's safe to assume that the Chairman Daytona is even rarer than a blue moon. It features a blue dial with solid details and an improved bezel of 400 units per hour. Yes, it's a magnificent timepiece to behold. Yes, it is so desirable. Yes, it's relatively impossible to find. Finding a unicorn is easier. Given how the Daytona is the only chronograph from the brand in continuous production, it occupies a privileged position in the hearts of many enthusiasts and collectors. Currently, early variants, like the exotic dial version worn by Paul Newman, are given preferential treatment. But thanks to the recent auction, things are changing, and the Newman Daytona watches are quickly approaching the status of being revered as a Grail watch, especially for those who don't mind spending hundreds of thousands or even $1 million on every occasion, just as long as it gets them what they want. Of course, just as already stated, the Zenith Daytona isn't a model you can easily assume to be a vintage piece. It's going to get there, but it's still in its transitional phase. And as we have already implied, Zenith Daytonas are part of the now booming trend of neo-vintage watches taking all over the horology scenes. So with that in mind, if you haven't been looking into getting one for yourself, you probably should.